Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I'm Kate Hanna from New Zealand, and I'm here to talk about how we worked on counting and countering the infodemic, the COVID-19 disinformation infodemic in Aotearoa New Zealand. First of all, I just want to acknowledge the traditional people of this land, ko ngā iwi o tēnei wāhi ki te Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. Behind me as I record is this beautiful maunga called Maungarei. That's a traditional mountain that belongs to the people of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, the people of Auckland or Tāmaki, Makaurau, where I work. The project team who've worked on this research that I'm going to present to you today are a really multidisciplinary project team. So there's myself. I'm a cultural historian of science and technology, my colleague Julio, who's a data scientist, Andrew Spall, who's a statistician and works in data visualization, Dentis, who's a philosopher who specializes in conspiracy theory, and then some students and early career researchers, Max Saw, who's in science and technology studies, Victoria Smith, who works again in science and technology studies, and Dan Barnett, who's in statistics and data visualization. We're all part of a group here in Aotearoa New Zealand called Pūnaha Matatini, which is a centre of research excellence for complex systems and networks. And we're a network of more than 100 transdisciplinary researchers and research students from across the country. Remarkably, for a group that started in 2015 and is mainly located across the computational sciences, we're a really diverse group. So our team is made up of up to 50% women, 13% of our researchers are Māori, and at least 3% of our researchers have Pacific ancestry. And in our recent peer review for some funding, increased funding we had from the New Zealand government, we were marked really highly by international reviewers for that diversity and how inclusive our research program is. So moving on from talking about who we are, I'll talk about some of the context for the work. We have a large group of people who specialise in thinking about researching and also implementing science communication or research communication. And some of the things we've noticed during the specific COVID-19 crisis are some critical features of science communication during a crisis. So those are that the usual norms and practices such as peer review, which govern the science community, are no longer available because of the need for really rapid fire scientific advice to policymakers and to communities during the infodemic and the pandemic. And that the coordination of expert response and messaging becomes difficult. Media are working on a very fast time cycle, even faster than the time cycles perhaps the governments are working on, and the demands on researchers who are able to talk to both governments and policymakers and the media become incredibly high, and this can contribute to aspects of the infodemic. The media themselves become a really, really essential channel of communication between experts and decision makers, because they're a tool for translating highly specialised research material into material that's more easily digestible. And we've really found that unstructured interactions and relationships which have been built on mutual trust and respect between our experts within Te Pūnaha Matatini and decision makers, and in fact communities, have become really critical. And we also really noticed that during this period of the infodemic and the pandemic, what experts choose to say or not say does really come down to personal values and value judgments. And you see a great variety of different interpretations of the same data in this kind of space. So we started out in February, March, communicating COVID-19 from our living rooms. In fact, the backdrop you can see me on there is the same backdrop I'm talking from now, which is sort of the background behind my desk from my work from home area. So my colleague and friend, microbiologist and science communicator, Susie Wiles, who you see there with the pink hair in her study, she had a really strong presence in the New Zealand media right from early to mid-January. Because of her expertise in microbiology and her understanding of the novel coronavirus as it emerged, but also because she's a really well-known and well-trusted communicator of science in the New Zealand media landscape. Soon after, another colleague of mine, Sean Hendy, who's a physicist and mathematical modeler, he began to run some early epidemiological models to try and understand what impacts might be in New Zealand, and shared those broadly amongst the broader team and also with colleagues in other parts of the sort of scientific community in New Zealand. And he became a really essential communicator of complex mathematical modelling and how that helps us understand epidemics. So I came on board a little bit later in early March because of really significant concerns that we had as a collective at Pūnaha, Matatini, and broadly within the New Zealand science community, of potential severe impacts on communities that already experience severe healthcare system inequities. So in New Zealand, those communities might be Indigenous Māori communities, urban communities made up of migrants and refugees, or Pacific Island communities within New Zealand, and also the community of people who have high health needs, but may experience inequities. So what is communicating amid the infodemic like? We were already contributing science communication, both to the public and with policymakers. But at some point in March, we were asked to contribute to a resource that was going to help the Office of the Prime Minister and Cabinet debunk a number of rumours or pieces of disinformation which had started to circulate in New Zealand by mid-March. And you'll see my large stop sign there. That's what we said. Stop! Debunking is not a great idea. And we had to really work closely with the team of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and people who were advising the New Zealand Prime Minister about why debunking or refuting disinformation directly isn't the best approach. And so what we did is we focused in those conversations around the idea of communicating with kindness. We understood that the Prime Minister and lots of other key individuals in the New Zealand government and administration were fielding a lot of questions from the public, but we noted that these really were centred from people's place of fear about the impact of the virus and keeping their families and themselves safe. So what we advised was against debunking, and we proposed a collective, calm and kindness-centred approach. So this was mid-March. We began developing shareable videos with prominent and well-respected New Zealanders from all walks of life to reinforce those messages. We scripted 2 to 3 videos with a former Prime Minister, a business leader, and a couple called Stacey and Scotty Morrison, who are very highly respected leaders in the Māori community, particularly in the Te Reo Māori, the Māori language community. And we filmed those videos. And we were in the process of having the 3rd video with Stacey and Scotty translated into Te Reo Māori so that it could be shared broadly amongst Māori speakers when the very rapid fire and changing situation of COVID-19 took place. And at that point, those videos became irrelevant because the New Zealand government developed this Unite Against COVID-19 communications system. So this is a screenshot of the Unite Against COVID-19's main page, which describes the New Zealand alert system level. So immediately after I'd filmed that material with Stacey and Scotty, the announcement was made that we were moving quickly from level 2, where we were, into level 3 and then into level 4 the next day into a complete lockdown in order to better prepare our health system for managing the crisis. And what we then saw was a really concerted effort around countering the infodemic by the New Zealand government and by New Zealand state agencies. So I just want to touch on a couple of features of that before I get into the work that we've done around what happened with the disinformation. So here you'll see Dr. Ashley Blomfeld, who's the New Zealand Director General of Health, and Jacinda Ardern, who's the New Zealand Prime Minister. So we had, during the period of level 3 and level 4 lockdown, and actually through in level 2 and 1, while there were still case counts going on, what we were called daily stand-ups. So every day at 1 p.m, the news media, television and radio journalists would play the footage of Jacinda and Ashley and sometimes other members of government if they were busy doing other things, reporting those case numbers, describing what was happening from a health situation and giving advice to the country. And there was some really key, critical, repeated messaging from those two individuals and the broader communication team within government. So those messages were ones around going hard and going early. So that's what New Zealand was doing. We were going hard against COVID-19 and going early was going into level 4. That we needed to be strong and be kind. There was a lot of use of te reo Māori phrases and greetings and words. There was always participation by a New Zealand Sign Language interpreter. So the 3 languages, official languages of New Zealand, were constantly present in these stand-ups. And both Jacinda and Ashley used sporting and martial or military metaphors. But the key metaphor that probably most New Zealanders really sat with and what resounded with people was the idea that we were part of a team of 5 million. So here we have an image drawn by a child, I think she was about 12 or 13, which was sent through to Juliette Gerard, who's the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. And here we show Jacinda Ardern, Juliette Gerard herself, another key science communicator, Nano Girl or Dr. Michelle Dickinson, Susie Wiles, who you've already seen, and also Professor Sean Hendy, who we've also seen previously. And they were seen as, by children and by members of the public, as being part of this team who were supporting us to unite against COVID-19. So it was really critical messaging where the scientific response lined up and supported the government's approach of kindness, of a lot of detail, and supporting people to understand what they needed to understand in terms of the public health interventions. But of course, that didn't mean there wasn't disinformation as part of the infodemic as well. Now, what we've done in the work that Te Pūnaha Matatini has been doing looking at disinformation is we've been monitoring it since the beginning of the infodemic and its impacts in New Zealand, so approximately the middle of February 2020. And we've carefully tried to define for ourselves and for our communicating about this research the difference between misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and conspiracy theories. So you can see here that misinformation is false, but it's been created without an intent to harm. Disinformation is also false, but it has a harmful intent. And malinformation is true information about people or places or things that has been used with ill intent. And these all have different, can be used and reused in different ways. So a piece of disinformation might be shared by somebody who has no ill intent in sharing it, but the result is still sharing of disinformation. Conspiracy is a purported explanation which cites conspiracy as the salient or most true cause of an event or phenomenon. And what we have seen is that a lot of the COVID-19 disinformation and misinformation does link to known and existing conspiracies. I just want to comment briefly on some of the methodology prior to getting into our description of disinformation. So it's a mixed methods approach that we've had here, where we've done discourse analysis and narrative analysis of rich text collated data sets alongside a computational analysis of sentiment and prevalence of disinformation and misinformation in the New Zealand social media and mainstream media landscape. So these have been focused on Aotearoa New Zealand. I want to point out that disinformation can be different for different people when they have a differential experience of the world. So Aotearoa New Zealand's communities have differential experiences of past pandemics. They have different measures of health and well-being, and they have different experiences of state services and state interventions. And that will be true internationally, particularly for marginalised or colonised peoples. The pandemic and the infodemic are also taking place within different nation states, and these states all have different political systems, worldviews, and approaches to healthcare and the role of government. So these contexts necessarily inform community and individual responses to the overabundance of information experienced. And I think these situated experiences are really critical to understanding how the infodemic is presented in New Zealand, and they enable us to better evaluate the ways in which the unreliable and untrustworthy information has differentially impacted our communities here in New Zealand. What we found was that looking at the prevalence, so the amount of reliable or unreliable sources during the different periods of alert level from February-March 2020 through to August-September 2020, when our most recent data was collected, remained actually fairly static. So there was not a huge movement between level changes to do with how much information was reliable or unreliable shared on social media. And that remained the same in August and September, which was the period of our election campaign, and also the period where we had another outbreak, what is called the Auckland August cluster. During that time, we were able to collect much more data, so it was a much significantly bigger sample size, but the amount of prevalence remained pretty much the same. And this showed us that it was really important that we were able to do this discourse analysis of the rich collated data to better understand what was actually going on in that text that was being shared. We did also look at mainstream media mentions of things around conspiracy to see if there was any connection between what was being shared on social media and what was being shared on mainstream media. And we did note that there was a huge uptick, you'll see here, in September 2020, late August 2020, in mainstream media discussion of the notion of conspiracy. And this was largely related to the discussions around the Auckland August outbreak. There were mentions of conspiracy and misinformation during those daily stand-ups by the Minister of Health, because there were concerns that some members of the community who might have been exposed to COVID-19 were refusing testing or not getting tested because they did not have great levels of belief in the existence of the virus. And this, of course, caused a lot of mainstream media reporters to investigate the notion of misinformation and disinformation. So that was why there was an increase in that discussion. And you'll see here when you look more closely at the detailed data during the different lockdown levels, that tick really coincided with our period in level 3 in Auckland. So we were in level 3 in Auckland for most of August, while the rest of the country was in level 2. So we obviously wanted to understand this discrepancy between the kind of static prevalence overall, but the big uptick in discussion, and also the nature of what had been talked about from February through to September and August. So what were the key meta-narratives that we saw in the discursive analysis during March and August? We saw narratives around distrust in government, narratives around the origins of the virus, narratives around denial of the virus, and what we've grouped together is health and well-being narratives. So they range from nearly denial of the virus's impacts, or our sort of that if you keep healthy and use the right vitamin C and sunlight and things like that, you won't be affected, or you won't be as badly affected by the virus. But there was marked change in the way that these were thematically shown over time. So if I show you this data, which is also present in our paper, you can see that in March and August, the discussion of the impact of the virus largely focused on assumptions around perhaps a low fatality rate in comparison to the flu that people are familiar with, discussions around the effects on the elderly as opposed to the general population, that there had been overestimation of severity and fatality, and that asymptomatic cases are the most common cases. So that brought around discussion of the notion of herd immunity. And those were happening on New Zealand social media during the months March to August. What we saw in August and September, remember when there was that uptick in discussion of conspiracy in the mainstream media, was slightly different thematic content in those narratives around the impact of the virus. So these focused on ideas that lockdowns are ineffective, that deaths have been overestimated or miscounted internationally. Again, there was discussion of herd immunity, but there was also discussion of those of the public health measures. So testing as being ineffective, and that the vaccine may be dangerous or could alter DNA. So those were really new and quite dangerous pieces of disinformation that were emerging into the New Zealand discourse. And similar things happened when we looked at the other themes or meta-narratives we'd looked at. So looking at denial of the virus and the virus origins. So you'll see that the prevalent virus origin and denial of virus narratives in March and August are highly fringe. are highly racist, highly xenophobic, have features of anti-Semitism. They're not ideas that most people would be attracted to because of the nature of the way they're presented as being xenophobic, anti-Semitic, racist. They're very extreme ideas around the manufacture of the virus in a laboratory in certain countries, and they particularly focus on racism towards China, which does feed into existing xenophobic narratives internationally and within New Zealand around the role of China in New Zealand and the Pacific, unfortunately. But then we see quite a significant shift in August and September. So from those fringe and extreme ideas, particularly focusing on other countries, we see denial of the virus moving into a New Zealand context, and specifically talking about New Zealand government purported interventions or behaviours. So these were accusations that the government was withholding information about the nature of community transmission, that the government was using or was planning to use pandemic powers to seize power or limit rights. We saw the emergence of anti-mask discourses in New Zealand, which seemed to be borrowed directly from other countries who had previously had quite a lot of discussion of mask wearing and anti-mask discourse. And there was also mention of martial law, the use of military force to compel people to be tested and to compel vaccination. So this was a really significant shift in the tenor and nature of the disinformation that was being presented. And so we wanted to understand why that shift had happened. We looked at conspiracy theories and the meta-narratives that conspiracy theories present. And they focus on a nature of a conspiracy and then who is being blamed or where the power is being assigned. And so what we sort of tried to break down the data that we had into was thinking about what the conspiracy was. So we had conspiracies around the origins or the release of the virus, right? And the people who were being blamed were deliberate, secret state or government actors, or perhaps state and government incompetence. And one of the features that we noticed was that scientists and public health experts were being categorized as part of that conspiracy. Another conspiracy we saw were sort of endgame, deep fake pandemic ones related to the election. And again, we see these as being blamed on a government having an opportunistic use of the pandemic to implement extreme, perhaps anti-democratic measures. And again, noting how prior through those infodemic conversations that we had in the beginning of this lecture, that scientists were seen as being lining up with the government. So scientists and public health experts were considered to be part of that group of people who might be getting blamed. And again, with hidden and suppressed cures or treatments, those again were being assigned as deliberate or secretive state or government activity, including for scientists. So this was really concerning for us as a group of scientists and researchers who had been advising government and working with government on providing really robust, transparent, trustworthy material during the infodemic and the pandemic. And we wanted to try and understand it more and better. What we then did was look at the role of narrators, so individual people within the New Zealand social media landscape who might be super spreaders for various different reasons. And we highlighted the fact that this period, the August-September period of the Auckland August cluster outbreak, also coincided with the New Zealand election period. We noted, again, as I said, that there had been huge mainstream media attention to the notion of misinformation and disinformation and also conspiracy, and that this had brought about some of the issues related to false balance and false consensus that we often see with contested pieces of science, where media think that a 50-50 presentation of both sides of the argument is the appropriate way to discuss something which clearly actually the weight of the science is much more heavily on one side than the other. We thought that there probably was a critical temporal or time link between the US and New Zealand election cycles, which might contribute to US-based disinformation and conspiracy theories being exported from the US and imported into New Zealand. And we also really noticed that what had started to happen during that period was that some respectable and trusted narrators, including politicians, had started to launder some of these more disinformation or conspiracy-based ideas into public discourses, usually not by directly mentioning them, but perhaps by asking questions or saying, hey, I'm just asking questions. And that really contributed to a level of uncertainty about what was trustworthy and reliable information. So I've noted here that there was a key role within New Zealand of politicians, academics, and media commentators and columnists, laundering more fringe ideas into the mainstream. So what does this mean in a historical context for New Zealand? We have to really note that there has been a critical variance in state responses, and a number of differing scientific or public health interventions and approaches have been advocated for. And while that's really scientifically robust, this can contribute and feed into a lack of trust in government interventions and planning, because it's part of the features of known conspiracy theory discourses. There will always be an element of truth to the conspiracy so that it's easier to believe and understand. But in the New Zealand context, as in many contexts internationally, conspiracy and prevalence towards believing or sympathising towards conspiracy sits within the context of colonisation, systemic racism, state failure, and also underfunding of public health. And particularly, I think, differential experience of state intervention in people's lives. So if the conspiracy is saying things like, if you don't vaccinate your children, they will be taken away from you, contextually, for some members of New Zealand society, the likelihood of the state taking children away from them is higher for Māori and Pacific peoples than it is for Pākehā or European New Zealanders. So that's specifically true in New Zealand for Māori, Pacific peoples and other communities who have experienced marginalisation or limited access to healthcare and other public agencies. And so the prevalence of those conspiracies during that time of the election campaign needs to be contextualised by that lived experience. But we have noticed the beginnings of narrative and also data change post the election. So we're currently working to assess any change in prevalence. So that's that baseline of the amount of unreliable or reliable information being seen since the 17th of October, which is when the New Zealand election was held. And our initial analysis has shown what is a really interesting feature, which is increased prevalence of discussion of New Zealand related to disinformation and conspiracy on international platforms, specifically Twitter and Reddit. But what we've started to see is what we think is a decrease or a static level of prevalence within New Zealand's own conspiracy nodes and networks, but also in general social media sharing. So there hasn't been much change within New Zealand, but there has been change of people talking about New Zealand and other places. And what's changed in the nature as well as prevalence is really interesting. So international narratives are increasingly showing signs of links to those conspiracies about deliberate secretive government activities. And we're seeing these present in both UK and US-based social and mainstream media about New Zealand. I want to then talk about trust in government. So the New Zealand election results are in many ways a survey or a proxy of a survey of our levels of belief in the conspiracy and disinformation narratives which were being promulgated on social and mainstream media prior to the election. The election results show a high level of trust in the actions of the current government. The failure of minor parties who had conspiracy theories and disinformation as part of their platform is significant. And this result is consistent with previous research about New Zealand's transparency of government and the level of trust that New Zealanders have in their government and state agencies. And research that we've been doing concurrently around the government communication strategies, which I showed you a little bit of before, really informs our understanding of this, so that we do understand that the ways in which the government communicated to the people of New Zealand during the infodemic helped increase that level of trust. But the international situation is concerning. and I don't understand yet, and our research group don't understand how the nature of the discourse has changed internationally during the period of the pandemic. And that's one of the things that we would like to look at further next. And we particularly want to look at the prevalence of belief in deliberate secretive government or intra-government actions, and whether those have increased, decreased, or remained static, given that that's the context of the international discourse about New Zealand in the present day. So those daily stand-ups that I referred to before, with their themes of kindness and the team of 5 million, seem to have really increased trust or allowed trust to remain strong in New Zealand with government actions, despite the nature of the disinformation about secret government activities that was happening concurrently. So the nature of narratives surrounding science and scientists has changed significantly, and in highly localised and situated ways during this period of the pandemic and our monitoring. So I think this really reflects both the actual differentiation in scientific recommendations and the ways in which they've been interpreted by states and leaders into policy approaches. That's not to say that there is consistent overall support completely for the New Zealand government approach. In Aotearoa New Zealand, we have a group of academics called the Plan B group. These people relate quite strongly internationally to the Great Barrington Declaration. There have been questions about the role of the World Health Organization and other intragovernmental organizations such as the United Nations. We've seen that across the board in the infodemic. And there have been questions, nationally and internationally about the role of national scientific bodies and advisors. There are a number of specific, what I call hot button issues around masks, so-called lockdowns, and an up and coming burgeoning issue around vaccination. And then there's also questions around the role of independent academic advice, such as took place in New Zealand, where we were publishing and presenting information concurrently to the public at the same time as presenting it to government, so that there could be increased transparency of what the government was receiving as advice. So from the Aotearoa New Zealand perspective, attempts at undermining via social media the widely shared consensus in support of the government's approach have had a number of different waves during the period of the pandemic. And these have been notable for the ways in which external players from other countries have targeted New Zealand social media users and individuals to question the scientific veracity of our collective response, and that they have engaged with conspiracy discourses to do so. We suggest that this is going to be an ongoing feature of national and international COVID-19 and other pandemic responses in the future, that there will be waves of disinformation, conspiracy, and quite specific targeting of different nations by users and bots. And it's something that should be worked on further, both at a research level and at an intragovernmental level. So what are we doing next? Because of those values that we have around inclusion and diversity in Pūnaha, Matatini, and within the Disinformation project, we want to now work on countering the infodemic and doing that in a really situated, localised Aotearoa New Zealand context. So what we're going to do is focus on vaccine and related health and wellbeing interventions. And what we've proposed is a highly situated, co-developed and co-managed research project with the Māori communities of Ngāti Porou, which is in the east of the North Island. You'll see on the map there, it's at the furthest east you can get. Places like Tolaga Bay and Hicks Bay there on the map are the first places in the world to receive the sunrise. So the concept is that we're going to have localised solutions grounded in authentic and culturally relevant stories, which will be embodied by culturally respected individuals. But the concept also extends to say that we think that this will have a high level of effectiveness for specific communities, the ones that create these stories about vaccination and public health interventions. But we believe that they will have highly transferable features for other national and international communities. I'd like to thank Te Pūnaha Matatini and the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment for funding the research that we've done, that we've been able to present to you today. Thank you. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou.